So to kick things off tonight, we do have Professor Steve Smith, who among a great many other things is one of the founders of the Sea Slug Census. I'll let Steve introduce himself and his work. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Thanks for that introduction. Before I share my screen, I'll just give a little bit of a background. Yeah, I'm a professor of marine science. I've been in the game for, well, too many years to count now. I'm a very passionate malacologist, so I love all things to do with mollusks, but I guess it's the sea slugs that have captured my attention the most over the last decade. And this is partly because we've got such a massive diversity in Australia and much of it is undescribed. And that was one of the motivations for starting the Sea Slug Census program, but I'll talk a bit more about that in terms of how it all started as I start my presentation, which I'll do right now. Okay, so the Sea Slug Census program, it actually started off back in 2013. I was doing a period of study leave, which is one of those academic privileges you get when you work in the university system sometimes. I was spending about 6 weeks in Nelson Bay, Port Stephens, just north of Newcastle in New South Wales, and diving pretty much every day with a couple of good friends. And we started this friendly rivalry to see who could find and photograph the most number of sea slugs. And after each dive, we'd sit down over a cuppa and discuss what we'd got. We realized that we were so passionate about this and getting so much out of it that we thought lots of other people might want to get engaged with it too. Sometimes it's a bit of a long stretch to put your passions onto other people, but in this case, it definitely happened. So Tom Davis and I, and I'll flick to the next slide. Here's Tom over here, and Nicola approached the president of the combined hunter underwater group and said, let's have a go and see if we can actually organize an event. And that was the first event back in December 2013. And from then it's gone from strength to strength. And as you can see, and I always like to start with the acknowledgements because we usually run out of time towards the end of talks, and these are the most important people. You'll see a couple of familiar faces here, and we might start with them simply for the reason that we are addressing a primarily Victorian audience here. But Cade and Nicole got on board very early in the piece, but I know we've got some of these other local organisers who do all the hard work on board. I know Julie sent a message through on the chat just now, but these are our local organisers who do a lot of the behind the scenes organising, send out all those communications to the local participants. And without them, we wouldn't have such a coordinated program. But I want to run through a couple of other people. I'm not a sea slug taxonomist or a taxonomic expert. I actually am much more interested in the ecology of sea slugs, but the ecology can only follow on when we actually know what species we're talking about. So clearly there's a necessity to engage in that sort of taxonomic quest so that we can drill down into that ecology later on. But over here on the right-hand side, we're very fortunate to have some newer and some much older taxonomists who've been very, very important in helping us. Richard Willan, who was involved right at the beginning of the program and still involved with the Sea Slug Census on the Gold Coast. Bob Byrne, who is just an incredible man. I still haven't met him, but I'm going to come down to Victoria just so that I can meet Bob. He's legendary within the field of sea slugs, and in fact, my favourite sea slug, which is Hancockkia burni, is named after Bob. And more recently, Matt Nims, who joined the program probably around about 2015, has now completed his PhD on sea slugs, the sea hares, and is going to make a really important contribution to the future of taxonomy of sea slugs in this country for sure. I want to make special mention to the four most, I guess, our newest local organisers, Christina Shaw in Vanuatu, Grace Keast, who'll be hosting another Sea Slug Census this weekend in Exmouth and Western Australia. Julie Schubert and Sabrina Velasco, they completed their Sea Slug Census just a couple of weekends ago. All right, enough of that, but thanks to everybody, and in particular, ahead of whenever the Melbourne one will be, to all those participants who get very cold at this time of year, diving, looking for those sea slugs. So this is probably a bit of a no-brainer. Who are the sea slugs? But it's always a good idea just to quickly run through what we're talking about, because the sea slugs are quite a varied, it's quite a varied group. When we talk about them as being the subclass Heterobranchia, we've got to have some science here. So part of the mollusks, the gastropods, and then the heterobranchs. And what we're talking about are the very obvious ones, like the sort of oval-shaped ones with the rhinophores and the very obvious gills, which are the dorid nudibranchs. We have the aelid nudibranchs with these dorsal serrata, and most of these feed on some kind of cnidarian, like hydrozoans or soft corals in the case of the one at the top. We have the dendronotids would have these tree-like processes growing out of their dorsal or their notum or their dorsal surface, and these are often mimicking their host. So the one at the bottom, for example, lives on a soft coral which has polyps which are almost identical to that. And this one here is Hancockia burni, the one I mentioned just briefly a minute ago. The sea hares, which is Matt's group, these are all herbivorous, so they feed on seaweeds. All of these ones over here are carnivorous. The beautiful bubble shells, some of these are tiny, some of them are much, much larger, like this one, mostly foraging in sand and eating things like worms or very small invertebrates in the sand. Head shield slugs, which make a similar living, and again, are incredibly colourful in terms of pattern. The sap-sucking sea slugs, now there's a good tongue twister for you to go with the Sea Slug Census, which have these stylet-like mouth parts which they can insert into their algal food and suck out the juice. The side-gilled sea slugs, and you get some really interesting big ones down in Victoria. And last but not least, the umbrella shells, and we only have 2 species within the east coast of Australia that we see regularly. So why focus on sea slugs? And why have we sort of pursued this through the Sea Slug Census program? Well, basically, they're a highly diverse group, and there are over 3,000 now. We get more and more every year, but 3,000 described species, but probably that many and possibly more that are completely undescribed at this stage. So it's an under-researched group of organisms. Why I'm really interested in them is because they have great potential as environmental sentinels or environmental indicators, because most of them live for much less than 1 year, so you can get rapid turnover, and most have very specific diets. And here's an example of one, the blue dragon, or Pteroelidia eanthina, and you can see here it's clasped with these oral palps here. It's actually clasping this hydroid and eating that. This was at Nelson Bay. So because of these really specific diets, if their food disappears, then they disappear as well. So they respond very rapidly to changing environmental conditions. We've already documented that in terms of climate change, where we've seen species moving south and quite rapidly moving south. Some introduced species which have moved all the way from southern Queensland right through to South Australia, for example, Spirilla brasiliana. But generally speaking, we're getting more and more tropical species much, much further south on the East Coast. The major challenge for looking at changes over time, though, is to have a reliable baseline. And really what we used to know about sea slugs was primarily confined to those major population centres, or where people were doing specific research. And so the Sea Slug Census program has given us the opportunity to gather a lot more information about the distribution patterns. So here's just an example. This is a paper that Matt and I published back in 2018, and it's showing the length of these lines here indicates the southward range extension that's occurred for, in this case, we documented 37 different species which had shifted south. And most of this data came from observations from Sea Slug Census program. So the role for citizen science is a really obvious one, because looking at the number of people who've tuned in tonight, you can tell that these sea slugs are incredibly popular with divers and rock pool ramblers. If you jump onto social media, and I've got a couple of favorite sites that I go to, like Underwater Macro Photographers, 69,000 members, and you get almost a third of those images of sea slugs, which is a much higher representation when you look at in terms of the total percentage of marine species that could be featured. But you've also got other places like Nudibase, fantastic forum for getting identifications and discussing, and many other sites as well. So this is a potentially really important resource for documenting diversity and distributions too. And we've been looking at this quite a lot for generating regional inventories, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So back to the citizen scientists, and what we did at Nelson Bay, we had our initial surveys we did every 3 months, and we had scientists and volunteers all doing surveys at the same time over the during the censuses, and we were able to look at address one of the questions which often comes up in citizen sciences. Some of my colleagues have said, well, why would you do citizen science? Because you're not going to get reliable data. And this was an opportunity to test that. We looked at a number of questions which are covered in a paper which I can make available if people are interested. But basically all I'm looking at here is, can citizen scientists provide an accurate snapshot of sea slug diversity? And these bars indicate the number of species found by scientists in the black and volunteers in the grey at each of the different censuses over this period of time, 13 censuses. The average was that volunteers found 89% of the species that scientists found, and that is a fantastic outcome. There were lots of other interesting outcomes in that a single census found as many species as 4 weeks of searching by scientists. So this shows the efficiency and the importance of citizen scientists in documenting species richness. We also gained some ecological insights, which we sort of had a rough idea about, but we got some fairly obvious patterns. This is for the chromodorids, which are primarily tropical in distribution. And we had these very obvious seasonal cycles of appearance and frequency of occurrence within Nelson Bay. So this is important ecological information, which I was particularly excited about. So far, I'm just going to give you a quick summary now. We've done 66 surveys since 2013, and the map here is primarily showing these southeast coast locations and the number of censuses, 8 in Melbourne, which is an amazing effort. But we've also got a few off picture here, like northwestern Western Australia, Vanuatu and Ambon. We've had 2,252 people who've participated, and they found between them 758 species, which is a massive effort. 311 of those species are single records. They've only been seen once. And 116 have only been found twice. And this really affirms the concept that sea slugs are rare in space and time. So quite often you'll find them on one occasion, you won't see them again for a long time. That's one of the things I'm particularly interested in too, trying to explain those patterns. In terms of range extensions, we've now got well over 60, and I haven't counted them all, but well over 60 species that have been recorded during this program as being well south of their known distribution ranges. So climate change is real, and it's being felt by sea slugs. The most frequently sighted species, and I'm sure these are going to feature in some of the images by our subsequent speakers, but up to 88% of censuses have found this particular, the clown nudibranch, as it's sometimes called, or Ceratosoma amoenum. And this one I'll just point out, the small sea hare, which has recently been renamed, or at least one of the types that we get along the east coast of Australia by Matt as the Plagia concava. And yes, the names change all the time, and it's difficult for everybody to keep up, trust me. One of the really nice things about this program, it started off, as I said, as a bit of a sort of friends challenge, and it's grown massively. Apart from this obvious COVID-related flat line here between 2019-20, we've had progressive increase in the number of venues, and that's increasing all the time with very strong interest expressed by divers in Perth, Rottnest Island, Christmas Island, which sounds pretty cool, Fiji and Bali, and we're getting more and more inquiries all the time. Kate asked me to comment on specifically about what we do with the data, because we are amassing quite a lot of data. The number one priority is to provide educational feedback for all the participants. So we do that through the distribution or the compilation distribution of reports, and those who've participated in events before will have seen these, which we make quite widely available. We extract information for scientific publication because it's important we get this out into that sort of scientific community. It values citizen science, and it really pushes forward the concept of sea slugs as indicators of environmental change. And one of my current projects, and I'll give you an example of this, is to basically develop a crowdsourced ID guide based on the images submitted. And that's going to be a fairly lengthy process, but I'm hoping that that can be sort of released as chapters for each family as we go along, and then updated as we get additional species. And also so that we, I think it's crazy to ignore the potential for important portals like iNaturalist, and we're certainly exploring the possibility of uploading images directly to iNaturalist as part of this process as well. These are just some examples of the papers that have come out that are based on, at least in part, some of the citizen science data. And these include inventories. So we've got an inventory here of sea slugs of New South Wales and one of Lord Howe Island. This is based on not just the Sea Slug Censuses, but those information in books, and also those social media sites that we were talking about. And we're working on one with Janine Baker at the moment for, we just started doing one for South Australia as well. This is what I'm hoping to produce for everybody who participates. And this is basically trying to source images of species from every location. And, you know, if we've got multiple locations with the same species, for example, Doto ostenta over here, trying to get as many of the sort of variations of that particular species depicted within these guides, because that's one of the hardest things. Is, you know, you get one image in a book and quite often there's a lot of variation around that. So crowdsourced images to provide ID guides, which will be distributed freely. The future, well, the future is obviously looking at more venues, and I'm getting very excited about where some of those might lead. One of the issues with the program, which has been fairly organic in the way it's evolved, is sometimes you just got to try and bring it in a little bit and standardize it so that we can conform to a standard approach, which will give us a lot more opportunity to generate very specific data. One of the things I liked, and this was Cade's initial suggestion, I believe, was having a challenge month where we get as many venues as possible. And the March challenge, while it was fraught with difficulties for some groups with bad weather, it was incredibly successful, and we got 7 locations all vying for the champion point score or species score for March. And Melbourne did particularly well in that one, I believe. Standardized report format with peer review. I think we've got some great data here. We do, as standard, we get the species identifications checked, and Bob does a fantastic job for Melbourne, and we have, but I think we want to extend that to make sure that every report we put out has been peer reviewed. And one of the other things I'm hoping to do in the not too distant future is get the organisers together and take some suggestions about how we can take this program forward. Importantly, one of the things that's come up time and time again is that we really don't know the names of a lot of these species because we don't have the taxonomic ability, not enough people working on these things within Australia. And some of the specimens that have been collected in the past are locked up in museums and not necessarily available. So what I'm really looking forward to trying to do is to work more closely with active taxonomists such as Matt to facilitate an advancement of knowledge about the Australian fauna. And one of the big things is, again, because it's been an organic process, is finding a new primary host and sponsors for the entire program. We have sponsors for each of the different locations, but I think trying to get this onto a better footing for consistency in this realm as well would be very, very advantageous for the whole program. Okay, and I think I've probably gone over my 20 minutes, but that's where I wanted to leave it. And I'm happy to take questions, but I will just put this up for a little bit more information. The Sea Slug Census Facebook site is where we post most of our reports. They're also posted on the specific Facebook sites for each of the census groups. But also these are where you can find those free downloads of the illustrated guides for Lord Howe Island in New South Wales, if you're interested. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, really enjoyed learning a bit more about some of the other groups and seeing some what's coming up on the horizon, I guess. That was really great. We do have a few questions. I know you talked about how you're an ecologist. A lot of them are kind of taxonomy based. One of the questions is, are sea slugs phylogenetically organized based solely on appearance?
No, that's a nice simple question to start off with. One of the reasons that we're getting so much variation and change in the species names, and even at the family level, is because integrated taxonomy is now the way we do stuff. I say we, that's in a broad sense. I don't actually do this. But yes, morphological variation is absolutely critical, and that's how all species were originally described based on their external and internal features. So with sea slugs, it's the radula or the mouth part. It's also things like other internal organs. It's the external appearance, but increasingly it's coming down to DNA as well. So when you're seeing species, for example, the chromodorids, with a big split within the chromodorids, and this is Goniobranchus versus Chromodoris, Hypsilodoris versus Phelomari, all these sorts of things have been related to the advances made through the genetic sequencing and using up to 3 or 4 different genes to try and differentiate between species, and even deeper into that sort of phylogenetic order, getting down to families and beyond.
There you go. So we there is one more question sort of around that kind of taxonomy thing, and that's basically sort of covered off on it, I think, but if you wanted to elaborate just where the plurobranchs and the sea hares fit in with sea slugs, because I guess that's one of the recurring questions, is how do we actually refer to this group of not quite monophyletic animals?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And basically, we had to, with the Sea Slug Census program, it's probably worth taking a step back and saying, well, what do we include and how can you convey that to people who might not be familiar with this? And we said, basically, as long as it looks like a slug and it's a mollusk. Now, some groups don't include bubble shells. So Nelson Bay, in the original Nelson Bay series, anything with a visible shell was excluded, whereas all other groups do include that. Now, luckily, there's not that many bubble shells in Port Stephens. We find them pretty much every time we go there anyway, so it's not a major oversight. So yeah, look, we definitely include all slugs, and if people are in any doubt whatsoever, always send in the images and we can make that deliberation. We often get sea cucumbers, we often get sea hare turds, we get all sorts of interesting things that come through, but it keeps us entertained.
Fair enough. I will ask one, I guess, more ecology-based question for you before we jump on to our next section. And this one, look, it is a bit of a local question, but it's about, there is some kind of urchin decimation of seaweeds going on in one of our local marine sanctuaries. And our question poster is just interested in whether or not there's, I guess, a lot of crossover with those kind of habitats with like seagrass and sea slugs, and whether this kind of urchin barren will have an impact on their habitat as well.
Absolutely. As I said right at the beginning, the sea slugs are very specific in terms of diet. So if you lose a primary diet, so seaweed, for example, then you'll see a reduction in the sea hares in particular. But also, as a secondary effect, a lot of those tiny little nudibranchs, like the dotos that our next speakers are so good at finding, live on the hydroids that live across the fronds or the laminae of those large brown seaweeds. So we're not just losing primary food, but we're losing habitat and secondary habitat. So absolutely it will have an impact on what you find in those environments, no question.
Yeah, so there you go. So that's another, it's pressing issue that a lot of people are aware of. And now if you care about your sea slugs, then you should be interested in what's going on there too. So again, thank you so much, Steve.